I've always wondered, how did I become so assimilated? I immigrated to the US at 10 years old. And it was so fast, to the point where even now with my sisters, like, we know Armenian. I speak Armenian when I'm in Armenia. I speak Armenian with my parents. But even now, between me and my sisters, like, we can't speak Armenian to each other. There's a weirdness to it. So I'm like, how did this even happen? I cannot point the finger. I cannot pinpoint how it happened. But why I'm saying this about whiteness as a race, as a erasure, I mean, I think it comes from a legacy, right, of what whiteness means. And I don't want to belong. I don't want to put myself. I don't want to allow it to do that to me, let's say. But when you were talking about capitalism as a rupture, it's you were talking about a certain way of life and a certain way of being in community that has been ruptured as a result of capitalism. And it's like I see a parallel, with what whiteness does and what capitalism does to bodies and to ways of being and relating and being in community, which is really harmful. And like, whenever I'm in moments, or when this understanding comes to me, or when I'm thinking about how this is happening, in so many, it's not just about Armenia, it's also, and within Armenian communities, I think it's just something that happens across the board in different communities, groups. And I always think, okay, the only thing that can survive this is something beyond material, like something beyond, like something that is, you cannot kill, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Or you cannot make die. I don't know how to say, and that is something that I'm sort of wondering how to make into a technology, let's say.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Other Armenias podcast. I am your co-host, Tamar Shirinyan.
And I am your other co-host, Milena Abrahamian.
So today we're going to have a very impromptu discussion. It's just Milena and I. We're going to talk about race, Armenians, racialization, and various questions surrounding that, mostly kind of framed perhaps through the question of, are Armenians people of color, which is a very US-centric kind of framework. And we'll talk about, how we each position ourselves around that. But before we get into our discussion, I just want to remind everybody to please like this video, subscribe to our channel. And if you want to get updates for when we have new episodes up, click that little bell on YouTube. That'll give you updates. And also to announce that we are now on Spotify. So if you would like to listen and not watch, if you're moving about, if you're on public transit, or if you're driving, you can now listen to us on Spotify. You can find us by looking up the other Armenias podcasts on Spotify. If you do find us on Spotify, remember to follow us, to follow the podcast there. All the episodes that we have are up on there right now. And to also rate us so that we can go up in the algorithm and other people can find us and listen to us. So, okay, with that, let's get into it. Race.
Yes. So just to also say that this conversation is I think that Tamara and I probably haven't talked about this, if not ever, at least like for a very, very long time. So this is kind of like a fun little experiment or surprise. So everything you're gonna hear today is we are going to hear it for the first time too from ourselves. So
Maybe from ourselves, but definitely from each other.
yeah, definitely from each other, but also from ourselves, like I feel like these conversations, a lot of times when you're talking to really like smart people, really wise people, like you like do this like bouncing thing where, a thought comes and is inspiring another thought in another person, and it helps to create knowledge. So I'm excited about that today. So yes, why did we want to have this conversation?
So I think like we haven't talked about why exactly for each of us, but I know that we've heard each other say at different points of time that we're both annoyed by the assertion that Armenians are people of color. Um, and I I think you know, I don't know exactly where I stand on that question, but I think the very framing is problematic, right? The Armenians are people of color. Um, and because it's so established by the US framework of what race means, and I'm thinking here of that, the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, or people of color, as if like, this is like a group of people that is basically like everybody. And they somehow, by being BIPOC, they have something in common. Um, a false setting up of how actual processes of racialization work. So I'd like to kind of think about that a little bit. But I know that you've also kind of been annoyed by that assertion. So
I have. I think mostly, maybe not external to me, but when it's like sort of connected to Armenianness, that's where I've been kind of annoyed, because for me, like I feel like I've never, for myself, thought of myself as a person or being part of that category as a person of color. But I know that there are Armenians who would put themselves in that category, which to me is, um, it's just a bit strange. What I'm thinking is that just to sort of, how to say this, like what's the word? Basically, to add to the thing that I'm saying, that I am aware that in the US context, this term, and why this kind of categorization kind of exists, has a lot to do with the history of struggle against, racism, against white supremacy, right? So there's groups of people who've been racialized, who've experienced violence due to that racialization, due to white supremacy, who've sort of come together to be a bigger group, or like kind of like to have power basically in numbers. And so it makes sense to me that, such a categorization has, you know, been established or is like a thing in the US as a way, as a tool, as one of the tools to sort of struggle against this massive, huge systems of power, within white sort of that white supremacy imposes, right? So I think that in this context, like it's not that I'm saying that, oh, what is this categorization? Obviously, there is like a reality and a lived experience and context and political, situation in which this makes sense. So it's not even about me saying that, oh, like, no, this shouldn't even exist as a category. I don't even think it would be my place to say, I think it's, for me, the question is when it comes to Armenians, um, and this categorization for ourselves. And even I think, sometimes I also even think like the fact that we could even think of like, oh, are we people of color or not, already implies that it's
yeah,
possible. We are so much in
yeah.
the sort of edges of whiteness, and so much, there's so much proximity with whiteness, I think, for Armenians, that we can even ask this question to ourselves. Um, and I think that there are lots of people who would also identify as people of color, let's say, who are also on like in proximity to whiteness, like white passing or having white privilege, right? So, yeah, and the yeah, maybe I'll stop there and if you have anything to add.
I guess like one of the things is I understand, how struggles against racism have kind of required alliances across boundaries. And of course, when we say, Black, Indigenous, or people of color meaning not Black or Indigenous, but also not necessarily white, um, that they're clearly what marks all of the bodies, the peoples, the subjectivities, the identities that make up that BIPOC category is racialization, right? So there have been, and in that sense, Armenians have had a history of racialization um in the US, right? And Armenians have been racialized in the US, and racialized as in to mark something other than white. But what I always kind of stumble on is the way in which racialization functions differently for differently racialized people. Like, so being Black historically has meant things very different from being Indigenous, for example, as in being Indigenous to the Americas. And people of color there also marks something different as well, right? So when it comes to the history of the United States, for example, being racialized as Black means like particular things that Ruth Wilson Gilmore defines racism. I mean, I guess not necessarily like Black racism or racism against Black people, but defines racism itself as using difference in order to do things to cause premature death amongst the population, right? So racialization is actually, it's not just like, being seen as different, or, being seen as eating gross food, which is like how my experiences with racialization have been tied to some of that stuff. But actually dying early and as a group, right, is what we mean by racialization. Or the definition that the working definition that I've been working with, because I find to be the most productive and explanatory one in terms of how racism actually functions. And we see this, like, and it's really, like really troubling, like when people who have not been racialized as Black, right, like people who come from places who that are predominantly Black, the some parts of the Caribbean or Africa, tend to, like, when upon arrival in the United States, tend to have like the same level of healthiness as generally like the white population in the United States. But it's only within one generation that Africans and other African diasporic people who come to the United States end up being racialized as Black, as in moving toward premature death, as in having serious health consequences. And I like that is what, to me, like what racialization looks like. And when you also think about indigenous peoples, the historical genocide, the complete displacement, and complete displacement. I mean, there are no groups of indigenous people today who live on their historic lands in the in at least not in the sovereign state of the United States of America. Mostly. But you see again premature death, structural factors that that preclude the possibility of living a decent life as the standard, right? One must actually struggle a great deal and overcome huge obstacles in order to live what we might otherwise consider a livable life, a healthy life. So when it comes to those who are people of color, right? Not Black and not Indigenous, things start to look a little bit different. And a lot of those who are, in different historical periods, it's different, of course, but a lot of the people who make up that category of people of color are like model minorities, right? People who come to the US and they're used as that, like, the model of, what Americans should actually strive for, and what Black people have failed to do, right? Look how successful Indians are in the United States. Look how successful Chinese Americans are as a group, as a population. And the fact that Black Americans cannot achieve that status of achievement, education, health, even, right, is something that's used like a hammer yet again, right? As in, there's something defunct about of being Black, right? That makes it so that Black people can't achieve the things that other people of color have been able to achieve. And I see Armenians as amongst that group of model minorities who have come to the US, often, not always. And here, I think we can talk about the different racialization of, of people who came from the Soviet Union, versus those who came from Western Armenia, and under different historical conditions. But there's class differences, right? And um, Armenians have typically, this is due, of course, to a lot of community work, but have able to manage a level of, like, of upward mobility in the United States, in ways that have completely been made impossible um, for Black people who come to the United States, as immigrants or refugees, and Black people who were forcefully brought to the United States, or who their ancestors were.
Do you mean the Armenians who came like in the beginning of the 20th century were able to move up more in terms of social mobility than those who came when the in the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed? Or wi- or
I
is it both?
I don't know. I don't know that, in terms of class, and I'm not an expert on Armenian diaspora in the US by any means. I mean, I have the experience of actually living in a family that was comprised of both
Both.
both sides.
Yeah.
Um, but there seems to be like a class difference. And I think, so, like, and this is where I think we need to really kind of think through this, and maybe talk through this. Is when I was growing up, it seemed to me that there was a palatable class difference between Western Armenians in the United States and by Eastern I mean Soviet Armenians.
Hmm.
Um, and but and because Western Armenians seemed more educated, they seemed more established. And that's partly because that was an older diaspora that was already here, that was
But
already within its, like, third generation, that had already established, ties and connections, and acculturated, assimilated in some ways to the United States. And now you had this new wave of diaspora coming who didn't have those things. And I think that's where that class difference perhaps lies. But I also think about how people who came from Soviet Armenia were so educated because they had received, I mean, most had received free higher education, um, which is not necessarily true for the Armenians who were already here from earlier migration patterns, who had been educated in the United States, and it wasn't for free, and, never had, been for free. Um, so yeah, but so the class difference to me, I wonder if it's just an affective feeling of, like, being fresh off the boat versus others who had been here. I don't know.
so I think for me, I think about global. I would go to more like let's say I would place a difference between the global and the US realities. And even though I say that the US sort of empire really does shape the global reality in most places, I do still think that there's a lot of resistance to that influence, even if it's not like through directly like trying to fight against it, but it's just because there's ways of life that have already been established, that have worked in many places globally, that are not the model of life that the United States tries to sort of, or has tried to, through globalization, sort of spread everywhere. But why I'm bringing this up, because I think it does matter uh, who is coming to the United States from the globe, from other places in the globe, whether it be Armenia, whether it be Kenya, Nigeria, I don't know, like Mongolia. It doesn't matter. If you are someone who has already some kind of class status and you're coming with that to the US, to me, I think that's part of, I mean, obviously it gets mixed up with racism and all of the other sort of isms in the United States. And then you either are able to sort of go up or whatever. In the US, it's called, try to sort of get into that American dream. Um, or you are hindered from doing that, depending on. But I think a lot of people who end up coming to the US are people who can move, right? I mean, even if you're, yeah, I don't, yeah, I think, yeah, I think that it matters. And why I'm saying this, when it comes to, I guess, when it comes to Armenians, um, yeah, yeah. So I think the ones who were here before, for many generations, at least for what you were just mentioning, 3 generations, they had time to sort of move up that particular not global, like US, American dream thing. Like they had time to at least, yeah, as you said, to assimilate. But I think it also matters that the US, or yeah, the West, sort of, the US, I mean, won the Cold War.
Mhm.
And it was like all these people from Armenia, Soviet Armenia, who were coming were the ones who lost. And like during traditionally, or like if we look at how, historically, like when you seize land, when you conquer land, you basically, the people of that land, you basically take them and they sort of exploit them for yourself. All the resources and everything, right? It's not just the people. So it's similar, you brought all the people from there who were educated, let's say, or who were also like bodies for the working force. My father was a taxi driver for more than 10 years in New York City. So, like, and he was a doctor in
Yep.
Armenia.
Yep.
And that's the story, I think, with a lot of immigrants, right? So that's also status there. But the fact that we were able to even come to the US really is the fact that we had a home that we could sell. Although I think
Yeah.
I always mention this, it's like in this, in Soviet Armenia, and I think from what I know from most Soviet sort of contexts, people were given homes. Like it
Yeah.
was just given. Like it wasn't even, you don't think about how am I supposed to buy a place. No, you're just given.
It was a state, it was a right. It was a human
Yeah,
right.
which is something unthinkable now, right? So it's not so much that, oh, look, it has this like material status, let's say, that we had a home because everyone did, but it was a material status to be a
Yep.
doctor, to be an engineer, to be a teacher, to be all these fancy things, and not to be a worker of the land, obviously. It's still within the Soviet Union. You still had this differences in terms of like hierarchy and who is considered.
Mhm.
Although if you look at some old Armenian movies that I absolutely love, you will see how
Mhm.
this Soviet or like the socialist idea of those who work the land, like the workers, they're the ones who are, to be respected and like seen as, higher form or whatever, like better
There's a moral value.
society. Yeah. Um, but it wasn't actually the case, I think, because I think anywhere that you have societies um, where you have people, where you have greed, where you have like people, actually, yeah, where you have also, I think, because it could be, we could connect it to, like when you are racialized, and I mean Armenians, and not only Armenians, like, I don't know, like all non-Russians, basically, within the Soviet Union were racialized, you know? So I think when you live in that kind of context where there is this kind of sort of illusion of, you know, we're all brothers and friends and whatever, sisters, but there are some who are because it's a global sort of, I mean, it wasn't, we are, let's say, white supremacy is a global, you know, it's not just affecting the US. It's not
Yeah.
just something that is a US thing. It's global north thing. It's, you know, it's just a white or whatever. Like, so to me it's also a Russian thing in a way, right?
Hmm.
Like if you're Russian, like you're part of this white race, right? And then you can look, and then you always need an other. You always need a darker other. You always need someone who's, you know, not white, basically, which is actually, and then you, so I think that when you have, you know, so because you have that, let's say, I connect it with class as well and wanting to be higher in that hierarchy or creating this. So it's like whiteness is connected to having resources, being able to exploit. And so if you're a doctor, maybe it makes you more white than if you are working the land. You see what I'm saying? And I'm sure I'm not saying anything new. I'm just not someone who's read books about this like that. So, but I know it just from hearing from my own family, from my own upbringing. You know, like how even today, you know, when I talk to my parents and ask them about, you know, these things, and I hear these things bringing being brought back, like when there's some person or business person, politician in Armenia who has risen to some level and has some power, and they're like, oh, you know who he used to be? He used to be a peasant. You know, like
Yeah.
this is a thing, you know, it's like, oh, he's not even from an elite class. So what I'm trying to say is that um I think that class and being racialized, basically like the I think the more wealth you have, the more white you can be, even if you're not white, if that makes sense. Like
Hmm.
you can be closer to that, yeah, somehow connected to being less close to the earth, less close to dirt, dark, all of the things that are considered uh not mm, non-white, basically. Like
But that's like a really interesting way of like, the racialization of class difference. Those who work the land, who are closer to the dirt, are some in some ways then I mean we could use a kind of like a civilizational hierarchy or closer to nature and thus less like civilized. And I think um the Russian proximity to whiteness, even in contemporary post-Soviet Russia, I think is tied to being a part of a legitimate European history, and being one of the European empires, and being one of the entities that exchanged in the imperial holdings of like the whole history of so-called Western civilization. Um, but now Russia has this other way of like, imagining that because they've been banished from whiteness, right? Because of that whole like perverse, you know, is it 70 years that, Russia lived under, evil communism, must have meant that they were never actually really part of European civilization, right? Um, and so now Russia's entire racial framing is not of being Europeanly civilized, but being part of but being founders of like a Eurasian civilization. So they're like, part of, they have the best of, both Europe and Asia. So it's like that's the Asian side of Russia that gives them even of a higher moral authority and moral ground to civilization than Europe has, because Europe is, after all, just one side of that. It's all fucking stupid, of course. But it
but that's
also,
so perverse. It's like they lost a certain European side of whiteness, and now they can. That speaks so much about whiteness and like what the things you can conquer. You know, like, oh, now we're gonna be like, oh, it's the Asian side is That's who we are. That's us. Like, you know what I mean? Like
But
we're
it's
gonna
also like an interesting, it's like a fascinating white supremacy because it's almost as if like white like we know like whiteness is not something that anybody can just be. Whiteness is something bestowed upon you by other whites. Like you can't you can't just claim like as Armenians we can't just say like we are white and then become white, right? Someone has to bestow that whiteness onto us for us to be white. And whiteness, of course, is so tied to the history of colonialism and global enslavement. And I mean, whiteness basically became both the epistemological, the knowledge ground justification, as well as the legal grounds for the oppression of other peoples on the planet. So it's almost as if Russia is rejecting that whiteness, but it's actually producing its own just as pernicious, you know, whiteness and white supremacy by making claims to this other form of civilization. But one of like the, going back to that question of class, what's really interesting is that like I agree that, in the Soviet era, Armenians, as well as, other peoples of the Caucasus, and, of course, probably at the lowest rung of the racialization ladder of the Soviet Union were Central Asians. But what's also really interesting is that both in that Soviet racial hierarchy as well as in the Ottoman Empire, Armenians were not the peasants or the poor or like Armenians were very well known merchants, and they were in some cases like in the Caucasus, like when at the beginnings of the communist movements in the Caucasus, Armenians were the factory owners that their unions and the Communist Party was fighting against. So I find it really fascinating that there is like we can locate this class and race um disparity. I mean, as in, they're not exactly this. You can't just map class and race on top. They're not exactly the same, because we see this in the history of Armenia, right? And like in the Ottoman Empire, we could also argue that Armenians were particularly attacked as a minority community, perhaps because of their economic power and the fact that they had.
But
Uh,
what kind of economic power did Armenians really have? I mean, when you look at in comparison within the Ottoman Empire.
So Armenians were, they had a lot of wealth and they controlled a lot of trade. Um, they had a lot of capital also. Like
But was it something that was so different from what other groups had? That's the question I'm
I
saying.
think
Is like,
so. Yeah, I think
really?
Armenians, yeah, did have that. And I know like, in the Caucasus, Armenians certainly had more. And this is like this becomes a strange kind of national tension because in some ways, Armenians who were more communist aligned, or even socialist aligned, found it difficult to think about, to whom their alliance was. Was it toward Armenians who actually were in control of large sectors of the economy in the Caucasus, um, or were they with the workers who were against all the Armenian owning classes? Or the owning classes who were in not all but large like Armenian, right? It's really like Azerbaijan and Georgia. Um, so yeah, that I mean, I mean, of course, it's different in terms of how Armenians then become a kind of ethnic minority. I mean, they're clearly one of the national minorities of the Soviet Union. Um, but in the Ottoman Empire, like and Armenians are like so tied, I think, to wealth and capital in the end of the toward the end of the Ottoman Empire that in fact, even today, right, there's this assumption by a lot of Turks that if they go digging in what used to be Armenian villages, they're going to find wealth and gold. And I mean, sometimes, they do, but because the idea is that these were like, really rich people
But I mean,
who,
I feel like that's part of it is a kind of stereotype, and a part of it is truth. But I think that I always had the impression that it's urban, the
yes,
Armenians that were
the
in
urban.
urban centers who had the wealth and who had the power, but not the Armenians who were in the in eastern Anatolia, who were just like basically like, yeah, like
Peasants.
killed off and like went on these death marches. I think these were just regular people, like who maybe had wealth, in their under like buried under under their homes or something, but maybe like from years of accumulating and like like not really. I don't know. I don't know. I always had the assumption that it was a very particular class thing within Armenian like society, where there were certain people who were in the urban, like Tbilisi, like Istanbul, what was it called back then? Anyways, yeah,
Constantinople.
like all these different centers in the area who were in urban places and who had wealth and who could move and blah blah blah. But it was the ones who were really like, yeah, I always struggle with this whole thing of like, oh, we commemorate the day of the genocide on April 24th because that was the day when all of these Armenian intellectual men were killed off. It's really like, yes, it's really sad, and I understand that people feel like their brains and blah 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 are being killed off. But to me, like, there's so much wisdom in people who were being killed off even before that, in villages who know how to tend to the land, who know how to do all these things. I don't know. So it was always to me like this is such a classist way of telling this history, like as if the people who are tending to land, it's going back to this thing, like yeah, I mean, even among Armenians, I think like you would see this. And yeah, I mean, even in Armenia today, like people who are villagers, like are and who are the ones growing our food, are the ones who are seen as, yeah, like not, well, what's the right word to use? Like they're not seen as valuable.
Yeah.
Their knowledge, their what they have to bring, and but yeah, I don't know if this is where you were going with it's just
Yeah,
it's
I
so.
mean, I think there's always class differences amongst what in any group other than a class. There's going to be class differences. I mean, there's even class differences within a class, depending on how you define a class. But I think that there is something about the fact that the community or the nation, or in Ottoman terms, maybe the millet, did have wealth, because that wealth also translates into um, aid and support to community centers, to churches, that then can be disseminated. Not always equally, of course. There's always, those who have the wealth, who hoard the wealth. But uh, that it does mean something for the national or ethnic community as a whole, that they belong to a community that does have wealth. But I think the main difference now in the post-Soviet era is the that it's maybe historically, and I'm not at all, I know so little about, and I know that we've been wanting to have someone on to talk about like medieval Armenia, and I think there's um a lot of a lot there that we can kind of look at and try to understand. And I don't know if any of the research on this stuff is being done in the context of medieval Armenia, but I, I you know it's almost as if for the first time historically, and I could be wrong about that, but the first time historically, those who have the wealth, right, and this is like, what's popularly called the oligarchy class, are actually not in large part using that to the benefit of the community, that in fact it is being hoarded and stolen from that so-called community, um, to the disadvantage of everybody within what is, the Republic of Armenia, which was, of course, such a huge offense and a betrayal by, yeah.
Do you mean now?
Now, yeah, now as in like, since essentially 1991. Yeah.
Well, I mean, to me, I always connect that to the this part of the world being opened up
Yeah.
for free markets
Mhm.
and neoliberal, like, you know, ways of life. And I think that's probably the case with many other places where you've had uh, anti-colonial struggles, and they've been independence has been gained, but then you still have this like elite, national elites in so many different
Uh-huh.
contexts and countries that hoard the wealth basically, and it's almost like a little agreement, negotiation, trade-off between global elites, corporations, and those national minorities who are basically like, yeah, exploiting the resources, the land, the people of their own people, and betraying, like you said. And I don't think it's specific to Armenia. I think it is very much about like globalization and
Yeah.
how countries have been exploited. Yeah.
But I think, that it is in some ways a rupture historically, right? Where you have, Armenians as a people who speak, the Armenian language, and who, are part of, the apostolic tradition and various other Christian traditions, have existed for a long time, right? And I mean, this is not to say as if there's been like, you know, a continuity from all of those, almost 2 millennia until today, but that one of the things that seems to have been continuous is this, um, that that wealth has been in some ways shared with the community. Of course, there have always been elites, and I actually would really love to understand better the exploitation um, of the surplus producers of medieval Armenia, which is something that I don't know too much about. Um, but that there has been this sense of, the church has been a center of Armenian life for a long time. And a large part of that is it providing space and care, for communities, especially people in need. And you see, like, now there's this capitalism is a rupture on the very sense of community. This is not exceptional to Armenia, but that like how we even understand the sense of a national community, or I guess the very idea of a national community is always historically tied to capital's emergence, but the community of people who speak a language, of who attend, a similar, religious, center, um, that capital really ruptures the relationship between the elite and the masses, and produces a different kind of relationship that actually historically has not existed in Armenia, as far as I'm aware. Um, and even that kind of idea of, like, other people, like, colonial powers exploiting Armenia. I remember being part of this conversation a while ago where, um, there was this argument about how Armenia's wealth should belong to Armenia. So Armenia's minerals, for example, should not be mined and exploited by the Russians or the British or the Americans or whoever it might be, but that Armenians should, if minerals are going to be mined in Armenia, it should be mined by Armenians, and it should be, refined by Armenians,
Poison us. Yeah.
processed.
Poisoned
Yeah.
our.
And it's like the question then is, um, if instead of some like Russian oligarch or a British, capitalist pig, killing Armenians to make profit, if we had an Armenian pig, killing Armenians to make profit, does that make it better? Right? It's an insane question.
Yeah.
Um, so capital doesn't have any national attribute or, you know,
It's interesting that we started to talk about race and that we got into this topic of class and now capitalism, because this is one thing that I always say, like, where I know for myself is that, like, I mean, we can also get into identity politics after this because I'm going to use this word now. But like, I, I, for myself, I can never identify as white.
yeah.
I identify as non-white, but that doesn't mean that I identify as a person of color, for example. So my sister the other day, I was like, "How do you identify?" She's like, "I identify ethnically as Armenian." I'm like, "Okay, interesting." This is like it's such a shop of things. But obviously, I know that when I'm ascribed whiteness, I benefit from white privilege. It's not about that. It's just for me. Why for me? Like it's like whiteness to me when it's ascribed if I were to frame myself within its confines, that would mean that I'm erasing myself. It would mean I'm erasing my like my whole history, my like all the people who came before me, a whole like land and time and place that has existed for a very very long time, and all of the knowledge and wisdom that is in my body and in my blood and in my psyche and my spirit as a result. And I don't want that to happen. And I'm aware that, being in the US or being in certain lands and places like that sort of is the sort of the assumed sort of thing that should happen to our bodies. We have to be we should be erased in different ways. I've always wondered, how did I become so assimilated? I immigrated to the US at 10 years old. I'm and it was so fast, to the point where even now with my sisters, like, we know Armenian. I speak Armenian when I'm in Armenia. I speak Armenian with my parents. But even now, between me and my sisters, like, we can't speak Armenian to each other. There's a weirdness to it. So I'm like, how did this even happen? I cannot point the finger. I cannot pinpoint how it happened. But why I'm saying this about whiteness as a race as erasure, I mean, I think it comes from a legacy, right, of what whiteness means. And I don't want to belong. I don't want to put myself. I don't want to allow it to do that to me, let's say. But when you were talking about capitalism as a rupture, it's you were talking about a certain way of life and a certain way of being in community that has been ruptured as a result of capitalism. And it's like I see a parallel, with what whiteness does and what capitalism does to bodies and to ways of being and relating and being in community, which is really harmful. And like whenever I'm in moments, or when this understanding comes to me, or when I'm thinking about how this is happening, in so many, it's not just about Armenia, it's also, and within Armenian communities, I think it's just something that happens across the board in different communities, groups. And I always think, okay, the only thing that can survive this is something beyond material, like something beyond, like something that is you cannot kill, basically.
Hmm.
So or you cannot make die. I don't know how to say, and that is something that I'm sort of wondering how to make into a technology, let's say. I was in this conference last week, 2 weeks ago, and there was talking to this person, this really beautiful human being who I met just for like 3 days, and who I really deeply connected with, someone from Mexico, an indigenous person who works with indigenous groups in Mexico. And in conversation with him, like, this is what I was saying in the beginning, is that when the wisdom can come out of you without you knowing you have that wisdom when you are relating with the right
Yeah.
person about it. And that's also a technology. But I said, love is the technology for life. It just came out of me. And we were both like, oh my God, that's such a great it's such a great phrase. And I want to, I think that that's one of the things, like I'm looking for these technologies that are not able to be captured so that we can reiterate them, affirm them, and bring them more about and be more aware of them and just use them, like as things that don't allow. And I think it's not just about that we find them, we use them, blah blah blah. I think they already exist, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't even be doing this right now.
Like tap into them.
What?
Like tap into them.
Yeah, yeah, like not to forget them or not to, yeah, like not to think that we don't have them, because I think capitalism and this kind of whole erasure, what it does is it makes you think that you don't know what you know already. It makes you think that you don't have the wisdom. It makes you think you don't have the knowledge, the technology of surviving it. And what's the word? Like when you survive over it, like there's a word. Um, uh, Preceding it? No.
Transcend.
Transcending it. Um, yeah, basically, it makes you think that it's bigger than, and it is bigger. It is bigger than all of us. It is so it's huge. These systems, like it seems like it's impossible to escape them, but um yeah, I'm trying to find this word because I hate when I can't find words. But I can't find it. It's fine. Um yeah. Why did I mention that? Well, yeah, well, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think I went too like over
No,
somewhere
I
like
have,
to another
there's
planet?
so much that I want to respond to that with, and I don't want to go into that direction right now because we're talking about race, but I don't think it's completely irrelevant. But one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is that, the way in which things that actually are quite simple are made complicated. And the whole like, well, it's complicated. There's two sides, or like, what about this and what about that? And um, one of the things I keep coming back to is that like I am pro-life. Like I am for life. And it's really not that difficult, to see, what is going to allow life to thrive and what is killing life, right? And any kind of struggle there is, and some are quite difficult because sometimes, when it comes to certain struggles, and especially when it comes to war, we sometimes have to take up the side that might have to momentarily work against life in order to make life eventually thrive, right? So I'm not again, I mean, I'm against war, of course, but I'm not against all forms of violence.
Yeah.
Violence is resistance. And but is it making life or is it making death? I think that's like it's actually quite easy if you take the thing you're examining and look at, what is going to, make for life and what is going to make for death, and take up the side of life, right? Um, so, but also, like, when you're talking about your own experiences of, or not your own experiences, but your sense of, I guess identity is the hated term that, I'll use for a second. I actually, and maybe it's not identity, but like, do I feel white or do I feel non-white or do I feel like a person of color? And I think really that changes depending on where I am and amongst whom I am. Um, it's really funny to me that I grew up in California. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, where most of the people I grew up with, most of the people that I went to school with, to high school with, were not white Americans. They were, most of them were first generation. A lot of the people I went, including myself, went to school with, were zero generation. I mean, we had not been born in the United States. And we were not born in Western Europe either, right? So it's like the demarcation. So I actually never I never felt I never felt white, but I never also had a longing for whiteness necessarily. But what I had an intense longing for growing up was Americanness. I wanted to be American, but because I was growing up in a largely not necessarily white context, American didn't necessarily mean white. It meant
Mm,
a certain kind of um you have a certain kind of aesthetic. It meant certain subcultures, it meant certain kinds of music. To me, that eventually by the end of high school meant punk. It meant, a certain kind of how I dressed and what I looked like and all of that. And I never thought of that as whiteness, although I think it's very akin to whiteness now that I
mm,
think about it retrospectively.
mm,
Um, I felt not white for the first time, I think. For the first time, probably in college, where I encountered more white people. And then I realized
mm,
my experience, even my experience, I went to college in Northern California where there were a lot more white people than there were in Los Angeles. And for the first time, I was like, oh, like all these people, like who a lot of these people who actually some of them grew up in Los Angeles, grew up in the white parts of Los Angeles, where they were experiencing non-white people as a different thing. Um, I think I felt non-white for the first time there, but when I really felt non-white was when I moved to the South in the United States. Because there, for a long time, the demographics of the US South are changing now, but for a long time, the US South was white and black. And there, obviously, I'm not black, but I was also obviously not white. And so I was what I like to call a different. People like literally, still today, I think don't know what to make of me, and especially the rural South. And one time when I was living in Jackson, Mississippi, I went to the grocery store and there was a black woman at the cash register, and she was like, "What are you?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" She was like, "Well, like, where are you from?" I'm like, "I grew up in California." And she was like, "Where are you from? Because you're not really like, you're not a Californian. Like, where are you from? You look really
She doesn't
exotic."
know that Armenians are Californians. She
I
doesn't
don't
know that
think,
Californians are Armenians.
but it's like it's a fucking Jackson, Mississippi. It's white and black. And so I'm like visibly neither. So what am I, right? And I, she said like you look exotic. And I was
Okay.
like, "Oh, okay." And then I realized I'm like a different, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. I used to
I
get
don't
that
know if that's racialization because
with me.
again, I'm not experiencing premature death as a result of it. Um, but it is kind of interesting to me that I felt really, really not white then, but not black.
You know what I was thinking? There is, when you were talking, when you started talking about the South and, like not being white there, the first thing that happened to me was like I just felt like how my body would feel there. Like, like in this, I felt like I would be in a very bracing, sort of like trying to protect myself mode. Like it just I had this like image, and I don't know if that's how it feels. I've never been to the South, so I really don't know. But I could imagine something like that, when you feel when you're different or exotic, there is you pose some kind of a threat. It's not the same kind of threat than, let's say, that if you were like racialized as black or racialized in a very particular way. Obviously it's not the same kind, right? But still there is an element of that, and you never know if some crazy like whites KKK saw you and they were like like, because to them it's like non-white is like already enough of a threat to, I think, that's what I'm assuming, like to want to kill off or something or harm, right? So to me, that also has elements of, it's not the same, right? But it does have elements of, you know not yeah, like not being safe, and then also all the things that that does to you. I don't know.
I think it depends. But yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking like, so maybe it's similar to, for example, like I lived in Sweden for 2 years. I had like a scholarship that to study there. And I remember maybe, I mean, I was mostly like, but I do remember like this feeling of being in spaces, even in public space. I remember like trying to hang out in like the front of my dorms one day in some like beautiful nature-y area. And there was a guy like who just was like looking, just basically got really like aggressive with me and told me like the Swedish older man, told me like you can't be here because you have your own designated. I mean, that could be about being OCD and not wanting, like people who are not from that particular yard to be in that yard, although it was right in front of my building. But the thing that he basically said is that people steal things from here. So we don't let people. And I remember experiencing this in other places, like not in the US so much, but in Europe and in other places where, like people, I remember there was, anyway, where people sort of assume things about me as like, I'm going to take something, I'm going to steal something, I'm going to cause trouble. So, but yeah, you know, one thing that so recently my father was telling me about my cousin who moved here in 2003, maybe 2002, 2003, something like that, from Russia. So a lot of my family like moved in the night in the 90s. Most of them moved, as many people did. And most moved to Russia because that was the most accessible. So my cousin was there with his family, and in the 90s, in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was a very hostile place for non-Russians or non-whites, and and especially for Armenians, but not only obviously, but they were super racialized there. And especially Armenian men were always had to sort of carry their documents with them when they were outside. And so I have two male cousins who sort of grew up as young men in Moscow in Russia. And I know one of them was like rarely leaving the house because of this when he was during an age when he should be like going out enjoying himself, blah blah blah, like 18, 19, 20. The other one too. And I think there was also a story where he and his mom were attacked in a metro by some white fascists. And this was common, like during those days. And when he moved here, my father was like, I was looking at hike and I was like, he was walking like in this brace position. And I would say to him, like, you're not in Russia anymore, like you can walk. This is different. This is a different country. I mean, that's also telling you, right, about the white passingness that he had as someone who was racialized in another context. When you come here, and because there's, I mean, yeah, because there's so much more, like there's a whole other history of race in the US, and more obviously like recognized people who are recognized. Armenians are not. I mean, you don't know what an Armenian is here. So in that way, being exotic can also like sort of be something that is, you know, helping you escape racialization for sure. It's not just something that is like it's just only a threat. Depends, I mean, in New York, being exotic can help you. Maybe in the South, being exotic is less helpful. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think the being exotic, but an unknown exotic is, I think, more helpful. Um, like, I'm not Arab, right? And I could be mistaken maybe for Arab. And I think if I were, that's where it would become dangerous. And I think that's where I would be scared in the US South. um, especially today. Uh, but I think that because there even isn't that big of an Arab population in Mississippi. And there is now like a South American population, a Latinx population in Mississippi and growing in the South, that has become a kind of a factor that could be really scary, racially, because it's a group that is feared because of, all of these racist tropes around immigrants from South America and Central America as being dangerous criminals and rapists and all of that. Uh, but I was an unknown quantity, and so I was just my presence was just strange. Um, but that could easily change. And there's also been like a lot of Armenians I know who've been mistook for being Arab, for being Muslims, and have had violence happen to them as a result of that. And I think, that's where we see where that, you earlier called it the edges of whiteness, right? And it's like, I think Armenians are on the edges of whiteness, but they're also on the edges of other kinds. And that's where it's like that marginal space where it could go one way or the other way. And if it goes one way, great for you. But if it goes the other way, it could present some problems. Like, and I think when we think about something like Islamophobia in the United States, we do also have to think about how Islamophobia is not about it's not about Islam. It's not about Muslims. It's not about Arabs either. It's about the assumptions of what that is and what that looks like and what it, the dangers it poses. And so in that case, anyone who gets lumped up into being a Muslim or being of the Islamic sort, right, might get caught up in it. And it has happened to Armenians as well. And of course, it also happens to Christian Arabs. It happens to people, it happens to Sikhs, it happens to Indians from who are Hindu or non-Muslim. So yeah, it's the context matters, history matters, right? Like, and I think there's like different moments in US history and also in Russia and in between where the same person could have very different racialized experiences, like you pointed out with your family member, right?
Yeah. And I think for me, it's also really important to point out globally, I think it's global, it's not just a US thing, anti-Black racism as a very particular thing that cuts across
Yeah.
everywhere. So in Russia,
Yeah.
that's there. And what my cousin was experiencing is connected to that. It's connected to that because there, I mean, obviously, I remember once this is terrible, but I remember once I think there was this Russian person I've also met in Sweden and who was saying he was saying some derogatory term in Russian, and I was like, I was telling him that the word is black. It's not any other word. And he was like, but that's what we call Armenians
Yeah.
in Russia. And I was like, yeah, you see, this is why it's all like, yeah, yeah, you don't have a word. The word black in Russian is already taken for people coming from, like the South or like whatever, like Russia's southern or whatever peripheral, like down South Caucasus and blah blah. And so people who are coming from who are actually black, are you have like the derogatory word is like one that is left for them to use
Yeah.
in their mind. Um, so I thought that was a really like twisted kind of way that this whole thing works. Yeah.
But also like in the US, the anti-black racism amongst Armenians in the US. So
Mm.
Like it's not, of course, if one is characterized as black, in another context, they might not necessarily see that applying black to anyone who they feel like is lower than them on the, racial hierarchy is one thing, but the fact that a lot of a lot of Armenians in the US have this sentiment that, the same racialized sentiments around black people in the United States. And um I think, it depends on where, which Armenian community, as in where it's located. But there's also a lot of anti-Latino sentiment in the United States, and assumptions around, like Mexicans as criminals, as perverts, as and about blackness too. Um, so, and that's where I think it's important to keep bringing back that the model minority question, because it becomes possible for Armenians to be racist in the United States, and I think that the being racist gives them proximity to whiteness, and that's part of the model minority status, right? The more racist you are as a community, right, the closer you are to becoming white in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's how you become. I have this uh well, when I become a writer that I want to become, but I have like a piece that I've worked on for several years, and there's like a part in it where I'm talking about when my family and I first immigrated here, and there was an Armenian family already here who was like who my father knew, and so they were the ones that we stayed with for a month before we were able to find a place to stay and all the things. And they were basically our introduction to America. So imagine Armenians who had also themselves immigrated several years back, felt like they already like knew how things work here, and the way that they were teaching us, or the things, the sort of messages they were sharing with us, it was also mostly like younger men of this family, like our like 16, 17-year-old, who were basically telling us these racist tropes about Black people, about Latin men in particular. Not only, of course, they were like, don't go here, don't go there, because there's trans people there, there's queers there, all of these things. Like they were basically everything that was, you know, that you need to know basically to become assimilated and move towards whiteness in America
Mhm.
as an ethnic people with proximity to whiteness. They were teaching us that basically. So it
Yeah.
makes sense. Do we
Yeah.
want to say anything about identity politics before? I don't know how long we've been talking so far, maybe, but we need to sort of move closer to ending this conversation.
Of which we will have many more, I'm sure. There's a lot of guests we have in mind who've, um, unlike myself and Milena, have actually researched the question of race, have actually done historical research on trying to understand how race functions. And um, I think this kind of conversation is really important, but it's also important to,
Yeah.
to think about, the historical facts of what has happened. And but I do think that I do want to talk a little bit about identity politics before we finish, because um part of my frustration with this whole like Armenians are people of color thing is the identity politics involved in it, and part of the way in which the identity politics works in this is again uh to deny the model minority links of Armenians in the United States, and not just in the United States, but perhaps in other contexts. In Europe, we can talk about maybe, although I think racialization functions a little bit differently in Europe. But the assumption that being Armenian thus then grants one the stamp of being oppressed, which is in some ways like a badge of honor. And I'm not, of course, we're talking about things, the genocide has come up in our conversation today. It comes up all the time on our podcast, and we're not at all, denying that Armenians historically have experienced an intense amount of oppression as well as racial and ethnic hatred, right? Which is what all genocide is established on ultimately. But I think that that kind of ignores the fact that Armenians are also racist. And I mean, we have to account for that. Armenians are incredibly racist. I mean, there have been um, there have been events, especially in California, in Los Angeles over the last few years, where there's a large number of Armenians living, where Armenians have done some really racist things. And I've heard my own family members spew racist garbage, quite frequently, in fact. And I think to, do that whole like Armenians are people of color dance is to ignore how, that also plays a big role in how Armenians, exist in the United States. And also it goes back to the conversation that we were having earlier about class, right? Identity politics cannot deal with the class question. It can't deal with the question of, um, you know, if Armenians are people of color and they're racialized, and this goes not just for Armenians, but any question of identity talk around race. When we're talking about racialization, I really believe that we have to keep in mind that question of premature death, because premature death is what racialization and racism and racial capitalism is founded on. So in that regard, you know, just because a person is a person of color, or even black for that matter, doesn't necessarily mean that they share in some kind of um, uh, necessary oppression attached to that racialization. So, you know, Kamala Harris is, half black, half, Indian, which, I would see as a model minority in the United States. Um, does she have anything in common with most black people in the United States? I would say no, right? She has nothing, nor is she, even working toward the benefits of, black people in the United States. Same could be said about Barack Obama. And, a lot of the people in the Armenian community in the United States and in Armenia, who are capitalists, who are oligarchs, who are piles of garbage, um, are they doing anything against racism toward Armenians, even toward, are they doing anything for anything, social, for justice, for life, right? No. So it doesn't tell us much, right? That identity category of I identify as doesn't tell us much about the actual material factors and conditions of life, nor struggles for justice.
Yeah, I think that's a really important way to frame it. Um, I mean, if we were to kind of go into the framing of um, and and I would say that, like again, what I said in the beginning of the podcast about there is a history to why this category came to be, and it is connected to like there's just a way to struggle against white supremacy and racism and all of these things collectively, let's say. I would add and say that would it be possible to also um, beyond just having identity politics in which people are simply sort of saying like, okay, I'm Armenian, or I'm white, or I'm a person of color, or I'm indigenous, or I'm black, or I'm middle class, or I'm working class, all of the things, or I'm, I have, I'm a disabled person, or I'm queer, all of these things that people say, how can we disrupt the how to say like constricting, limiting aspects of categorization, which is also how race was
Yeah.
constructed to begin with,
Yeah.
to be able to disrupt it, uh, and go sort of bring in like other aspects of meaning in terms of like our political positionalities, what we stand for, what we fight for, what we what we are, doing to just sort of create more possibility for, you know, like life. You mentioned this earlier. So I would say to add things as opposed to say like, this shouldn't be. I think that coming from a place of like respecting where things come from, why things come, and but then also understanding how capitalism co-opts everything, like making sure to constantly disrupt and just, staying human. That was another thing I was saying, you mentioned something before about life and death. One thing I would say is that I always thought saying pro-life is so weird. Just so weird. It means another thing when you look at it from this other perspective. I would say, yeah, like, I am for life. And then death, I mean, would I say death as the opposite of life? I wouldn't. I would say non-life. Non-life is very, very particular compared to death. Death is a very important part of life that I think, yeah, like, what's it called? Fertilizes it or like gives, it's death is a very important thing, I think, and I would not want to put like a negative thing on it. I would say instead to say non-life. So how do we create ways to disrupt things that take us towards non-life and
Mm.
move us more towards life, which includes death, but not non-life. If that makes any sense,
Yeah, and I think also in regard to that non-life, that's part of the problem of categorization, the setting up of like, this and that and that and that and the other is actually non-life because it's not what lived reality is. And there's you know, I would say, that lived reality is far more complex
and
in
messy.
and messy and where it fits and alliances and resistance and attachments sometimes, right, to things that are destructive. Like, we both talked about our attachments to Americanness, whiteness, um, and I think there's also an attachment to non-whiteness that also hurts us in our ability to be self-reflexive and in our ability to actually be in solidarity with racialized peoples when we insist that we are that thing that in real life we might have less in common with than whiteness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This was intense. Yeah, I think I just wanna, just think this is a very difficult thing to talk about in general, I think in many spaces. And I just want to say like kudos to us for doing it and also to those listening, just to know that we don't know everything and we can we make ourselves vulnerable. And I felt quite vulnerable in this because we
Yeah.
didn't have a guest or someone that we can just attach to and be like, you know the answers. But yeah, so just be aware, dear listeners, that we've made ourselves quite vulnerable today to talk about these things. And maybe in some other episodes, we might go back and say, oh, these things, some of the things we said, maybe we add to it or we take away from it. But
Yeah.
yeah, you can also leave comments.
Please leave comments. We'd
Yeah,
love to know what you think about this a conversation, especially.
yeah,
So our next episode is going to be very exciting. We are not announcing yet what it will be, but it will be an interview, I think. Um, with two really, really amazing folks. So please stay tuned. That will be up on May 30th. And like all of our other episodes, please subscribe on YouTube. Please go to Spotify, rate us, follow the channel there. And we would love to hear from you in comments on any of these platforms.
Yeah, and thank you for being with us and
Thank,
listening to us. Take
thank
care.
you. Bye, y'all.